Welcome to the Fall 20 Inspire Virtual Institute. I'm Herman Felton, one of the founders of the Higher Education Leadership Foundation, and boy, have we had a doozy today. But there's good news. It gets better, if you can even believe that. Today, we're really excited and fortunate to have two brilliant, I would say, researchers slash ombudsman type. They are practitioners in state policy. They are board of trustee folks. They are fixers. But certainly they are here to add value to this institute. Joining us today at our 12 o'clock institute panel entitled All Politics Are Not Local, Navigating and Negotiating State Policy, are two good friends and colleagues. Scott Jenkins, who is the state policy director for the Lumina Foundation, is joining us today. Welcome, Scott. And joining him is, as I mentioned, a good friend as well as a colleague, Nicole Washington, who is a consultant but is a principal of a organization that she created herself, and she will share with you that, and also is a staunch advocate for education, a member of the Board of Trustees at Florida A&M University in Tallahassee, Florida. Welcome, Scott and Nicole.
Thank you very much, Dr. Felton. It's an honor to be with you all today. And I could not do a presentation about state policy, state and national, without having Nicole Washington, who is just an amazing practitioner, as Dr. Felton says. As Dr. Felton said, my name is Scott Jenkins. I'm the strategy director for state policy for the Lumina Foundation. And while I work in philanthropy now, my background is actually in state and federal policymaking. I have worked both in the Florida legislature, in the Michigan legislature, and worked for governors in Michigan and in Indiana. And so I come to philanthropy in a different route than most people, through actually the operational or practitioner side, in state and federal relations and state and federal government. I'm going to try and introduce Nicole Washington because I'm just so humbled that she joined me today. Nicole is has a consulting practice, but has worked with me at Lumina Foundation and for the foundation as a principal consultant, representing Florida for a long time, probably well over 5-6 years. She is, if there is a human being that is the nexus point for higher education policy and practice in Florida, it is Nicole Washington. She serves on both the Florida A&M board and the Miami-Dade College board. She served as a member of the Constitutional Revision Commission, where she was instrumental in placing the community colleges within the Constitution. So if you need to understand the steps by which you do things like getting Florida to an attainment goal, you pick up the phone and you call Nicole Washington. And she will gladly fill in any gaps that I've left. She's also a very doting aunt. What we hope to do today is spend about 30 minutes of your time talking to you a little bit about the environment in which higher education sits within states in the national context. We're then going to talk a little bit about kind of the foundations of how, when you're at an institution, you gain the support and endorsement of your board, of your faculty and others to lead in state policy, and then talk a little bit more about kind of the practice of state policy and state engagement and state legislative lobbying and that type of thing, and then have Dr. Felton come back and facilitate a Q&A. With that, why don't I hand off to Nicole to introduce herself in a much more proper way, and talk about kind of the environmental context a little bit, and then we'll continue. We'll start our conversation.
Thank you, Scott, and thank you all for being here today. Scott, there's no more introduction that I could provide. You make me, I wish we could have, well, it is recorded, so I will go back and use that later, all of that content. So thank you all for having me. And as Scott and Herman mentioned, I sit in a place as a trustee that is not the commonplace for many trustees in the field. So here to just provide some insight and answer questions as needed. But thinking about the context in which higher education sits in today, I think it's important for all of us to realize that higher education is more important today than it ever has been. However, due to both contextual conversations around the value of higher education exacerbated by a pandemic, policymakers, corporate leaders, accreditors, there are so many people asking for so much out of higher education. And meanwhile, we're all grappling with budgetary, financial complications, completion, trying to increase completion. And this is something that we're all doing together. So, as a trustee, I think that there's a concept that, we're these disembodied folks who sit around a table or a dais and really just create policy out of context. And I would like to assure you that that is not the case. We as trustees have a different viewpoint, but we are aware both from the higher ed and a national perspective of what's changing and are really in tuned with and want to be all of your best advocates. And so, part of my discussion later will be on how to really engage your trustees in a productive way to make sure that they have the information, education they need, so that as we are all balancing this pandemic and situations and the future of higher ed, which is obviously changing, that we can do it with fidelity, and that we are all working together.
That's great, Nicole. From my background, which is kind of state budget and state policy, wanted to provide you also just some contextual information. This pandemic has created the potential for what I've referred to as an extinction level event for state attainment goals, state higher education policy agendas, and equity agendas. Moody's Analytics estimates that state and local budget shortfalls will total $500 billion over the next 2 years. American Enterprise Institute estimates state sales and income tax revenues in 2021 will be about $105 billion short of expectations. The Tax Policy Center puts that gap at $125 billion, and the Center on Budget and Policy Priorities estimates $290 billion shortfall. As we head into the first quarter, state revenues look pretty precarious. Not necessarily as bad as what we've seen, but it's clear that this is going to there's going to be a long tail of revenue impact from the pandemic and the depression caused by it. A little context also from Lumina and where Lumina is as a foundation. Our state policy work that we are working to develop is going to narrow, and it's going to focus exclusively on racial equity within state budgets, policy, and practice. We believe we also need to kind of change our language and narrative around key policies that result in oppression. And it can help us to articulate these policies that they represent pervasive and enduring racism, resulting in negative outcomes for students of color and inhibit in the institutions who serve those students. The intentionally or unintentionally designed policies that serve to impair the ability of Black, Hispanic, and Native American students from participation and success in post-secondary education need to be identified and eliminated. And we propose that by changing our language and narrative to articulate how these policies really represent the Jim Crow in higher education. And we will be focusing on our state policy work to identify and dismantle and rebuild unfair and unjust, the trinity of Jim Crow in higher education, which we determine as funding formulas, financial aid policy, and recognition of learning. We picked these three areas because this is where the structural racism within the system causes the most damage to learners of color and the institutions that serve them. One way to think about these three areas and link to state policy is that what can states do for institutions that serve equity populations, what states can do for students of color, and what states can do to ensure that those students get the credit they earned and deserve. And so our state policy work will move forward from being much more of a cautious ally to being a co-conspirator in this insurgency. We're going to spend some of our hard-earned reputational capital to aid and abet some good trouble. And Lumina will model, assume risk, provide cover, support, and oxygen to state leaders committed to a racial equity agenda and leadership. And it's where we can lend a hand to your work as you begin to engage in state policy work at your institution and within your state. What I'd like to, I'll hand it now to Nicole to talk a little bit about, the foundation work that can be done at your institutions. It's hard to have a successful external facing agenda if you haven't received buy-in internally for that agenda. And so Nicole, why don't you talk a little bit about how you've managed to see that that work happening at your institutions that you've worked with?
Sure. I mean, Scott, you brought up some really, critical points, and the role that I serve, I'm able to really see the connection between policy and practice. And when you talk about the foundational elements, I alluded to them earlier. The foundation is the presidents can't succeed in a vacuum without their trustees, and trustees cannot be successful without, a good working relationship with their presidents. And everyone is really moving towards the same goal, which is ensuring that the institution is successful, students are successful, and the institution is sustainable and thriving, and ready to take on the challenges of the next however long. And so when thinking about foundational elements, when I came onto the board several years ago, I really sat down with my president and had some really interesting, we just had some getting to know each other conversations. And looking back on it, I think that's really, really important, because that allowed for us to start to listen to one another, to start to build trust, to start to identify areas within the institution that we could really work together to move forward. And one of those instances or policies was around transfer at Florida A&M. And so Florida is known for having a incredibly robust statewide articulation system. Florida A&M at the time had a relatively low transfer student population, and our enrollment was declining at the time. And so there, we had several conversations around, my president and I had several conversations around increasing transfer as a mechanism to both increase equity, right? So Florida A&M is the only public HBCU in the State University system of Florida. And we have 28 feeder institutions across the state, which are our Florida college system. And so, and many students from many of the colleges would like to attend Florida A&M, but we had not yet built that robust transfer pathway. And so working together over time, we've actually been able to both increase our enrollment and increase support services for this critical group of students. It was not so much a policy change as a culture shift, and being able to make sure that when students arrived on campus or before even actually applying to FAMU as a transfer student, you were welcome, you were engaged, you knew what was happening on campus, and we had representatives that were there to help, advise you through your upper division classes. And that was something that required, the board to really buy into. We spent several board meetings talking about our transfer populations, what we saw as success. We worked with our governmental oversight entity, which is our board of governors, and really pushed to even include that in our performance funding mechanism, because it was really, really important. And we recognized our ability to really break down some of the equity gaps that we saw coming out of the college system as far as transfer. That's just one example. I've got obviously lots of them, but I'm sure, Scott, what else you got for me?
Well, you kind of point out the issue that that this was really not a state policy issue. While state policy enabled it, it was a cultural issue at the institution that had to overcome it, and now has basically put their stake in the ground and said, we're going to do this, we're going to do it successfully. And so much so that they put at risk the state policy aspects of this, putting at risk their budget to do it well, but also then being much more assertive and being entrepreneurial with how you see the institution being able to serve the students who really want to go to FAMU and want the FAMU experience, even if they're only getting it for the last 2 or 3 years of their time at the institution. And so I think that how when you think about that work, the value to having the board engaged in kind of their heads up, understanding the ecosystem of higher education within the state. How do you see presidents and other leaders being able to use the board to, work with coalitions, work with employers, work with legislators, and things like that? How have you seen that happen?
So I will say, again, your board is your biggest advocate. And while, they may come from and usually come from outside of higher education, they have connections that you probably can't even begin to imagine. And so there's a really important education component that really needs to happen on board training, and not, the laborious, 6-hour training where you go through, the microeconomics of your budget, but sort of the really laying out what the strategic vision of the institution is and where pain points might be that the board can really provide political cover. Because what everybody, what I really want folks to understand is that if a problem happens at the institution, your governor, especially if you're a public institution, your governor is probably going to call one of your board members before they call the president. And so making sure that your board is informed and is able to put in context what is happening and be able to relay that message as an advocate is going to be critically important. We've had, Scott mentioned, budgets are in jeopardy this year. So Florida has about a $5.4 billion deficit right now that we're looking to reduce. And both our legislative leaders have said that higher education is going to be a place where we look to plug those gaps. And so looking at, we could look at FAM as one of the university system institutions and really lean into what is the value that FAM brings and how do we leverage that to make sure that we are not harmed, or our students are not harmed in this process. That's going to be very important, and getting your trustees that message early on is critical to being able to ensure success in the long term. It's got an example I have of our privates. Obviously, Herman is a proud alum of one of our three private HBCUs in the state. And so last year, our 3 private HBCUs along with FAM got together and really did a concerted collaborative effort to show value of HBCUs in the state. And they worked with our legislative leaders, they worked with our governor, and over time, it might seem contrary to what you would expect, as our governor is Republican and so is both our chambers of the House. They were able to secure, the 3 private HBCUs were able to secure the largest appropriation for operational support that they've received in years. And so, collaboration matters. Collaboration matters not only with your board members, but also with other institutions across the system that might be like you or have a shared interest. And your board might be able to make those connections, because while I serve both on the Florida A&M and the Miami-Dade board, we also have a board member that serves on both the Florida A&M board and the Bethune-Cookman board. So there are a lot of synergies and connections between board members that are able to then leverage those partnerships.
I really think that's great. Great stories. I think if for the people watching today, a couple things that I took away from that is, one, see your board not as an obstacle, but as an asset. And so when you're asked the question, how do you engage in state policy? That may seem like a really large question, but the first question is, you need to do an asset map of your board members. who are they? Where did they graduate from? What communities do they live in? What relationships do they have? How did they get to where they are? And having that kind of personal relationship with them, because then you can, once they own and feel a sense of ownership in the agenda that you're proposing, you then have allies that are well connected that can help to support that agenda. The other thing I heard you say was that especially with HBCUs, we together we survive, alone we die, and definitely together you thrive. So by forming that coalition, and not going against each other in what might be a rough and tumble legislative process, you're able to kind of echo that value to policymakers and to others. And so I think that's a really, and from what you told me, that the appropriation, FAMU's engagement was in the we're supporting our fellow HBCU institutions because they serve the student population that we need to serve well, and not necessarily because it was what's in it for FAMU directly. It wasn't a transactional allegiance. It was a strategic alliance that can now carry forward, I hope, for a while. Any thoughts on that?
I definitely agree with that. So there have been, to a state policy issue, right? So performance funding has been an issue in the state for several years. So Florida adopted a performance funding model back in 2012, 2013. And over time it has evolved. And when thinking about, how you can leverage your trustees on a specific state policy issue, Florida A&M has had one of the metrics is the percent of students enrolled who are Pell eligible, and so, or on receiving Pell. And so Florida A&M has one of the highest in the country. Has the highest in the state, and a pretty high level nationally. And so what we've been able to do as trustees is not only work with the state legislature, but work with our governing board to really say, this is the value. This is, while we understand and are completely appreciative of our place in the system, the population we serve does not always echo the populations of our sister institutions. And I think part of what happened with this collaboration over the last year is that message got echoed, right? So even though Florida A&M didn't necessarily get the operational support, they did get some leverage, and we were able to include some performance funding metrics and change, some scales that actually helped as far as our performance on our performance funding mechanism. So yes, it was not transactional. It is just the amplifying of the message to several different audiences for different purposes.
That's great. The other thing I thought about as you were talking is that, and I say this a lot to my colleagues at Lumina Foundation, is that in state policy we work with both the noble and the profane. We have allies and co-conspirators, and then coming from the South, we have a phrase called chicken and pig with regard to breakfast. And the chicken's interested in your breakfast, the pig is committed. Allies are interested in you getting a fair shake. Co-conspirators are committed to that work. And I think as you think about looking at the assets external to your institutions, it's not always going to be as easy as looking at what party affiliation they have. And that you may find you are probably better suited to assume that you can form friendships and alliances and relationships around the students you're serving, regardless of what people's affiliation might be. And ways to do that tend to be personal outreach. They can be through collaborations with community organizations, community elected leaders, through your trustees, like you indicated, Nicole, but also through your faculty and your students. Don't diminish the ability of your students to get a conversation with a legislator, or get a conversation with a legislative staff member that you can help to facilitate. So all of you are going to work for institutions where you're going to need to punch above your weight class in legislative policymaking. The way to do that is to make sure you have as many allies and even more co-conspirators as you go into that process. Herman, I see you're back. Thanks.
I am. I thought I was just shook by the allies are interested, co-conspirators are committed. I can't think of a more powerful way to really punctuate the point and the difference between the two, and how critically important it are. They both are. There are a few questions, actually a good little bit of questions. So I'm going to start with Nicole, ladies first. Scott, if you don't mind. You're a board of trustee, and boards hire presidents. What does a candidate do to be attractive or to stand out during the hiring process? That's a question. I know it's a loaded one, but if you could tell through your processes of hiring presidents, both at the community college level and at the four-year institution level, what sticks out to you as a board member when a litany of candidates come through?
So, having just gone through a search process, this is an area that is near and dear, and also maybe slightly PTSD to my heart. But I will say, having just gone through the process at Miami-Dade, there are several considerations that go into it. In Florida specifically, because we have such broad sunshine laws, the candidates who actually end up applying, have a very high level of scrutiny from very early in the process. And so I think that's something that we, in Florida, we're very cognizant of. What stood out to us, and I'm trying to sort of think about the vetting process, was leaders that demonstrate authenticity, leaders that are able to show vision, but are able to translate that vision also into action and implementation, because I think both of those matter. There's a definite difference between folks who rise to the top as leaders versus administrators. And I think that there's a difference there, and depending on the needs of your institution and sort of what is the best fit at the time and what the skill set that institution really needs. And so what I would say to folks who are considering applying, you should look at the institution, not necessarily in name, but the composition of the institution. You should look at the strategic plan of the institution. You should really get a feel for where they have been and where they're trying to go, areas of improvement, and do those match with your skill set. So where have there been pain points, and how do you fill those gaps? And that's what you should be able to bring to your interview.
Scott, Jackie Malcolm wants to know, how do we as higher education leaders ensure that we keep ourselves aware of the trends in state policy, and what resources do you recommend for that practice?
It's a really great question. There's lots of several national organizations that tend to have their finger on what is happening at the state level. The State Higher Education Executive Officers Association, H.E.L.F, which annually puts out a report on state budgets and state finances, also keeps track of kind of policy making that's happening to understand that. I think also some of the membership organizations, like the National Conference of State Legislatures, National Governors Association, they all have some work around post-secondary education, but it's rather selective. Another source is there are more foundations these days than just the Gates Foundation and Lumina Foundation that do higher ed work. You can always come to Lumina Foundation's Strategy Labs website, which has research reports and other types of things that have come out. You can also come to Lumina Foundation and get on our daily mail list, which is basically a curated, here's what's happening in higher education today, from racial equity issues to recent new research reports, new policy that's being issued, human work, and just sign up for that daily news blast, and it's a pretty good way to stay in tune with what's happening.
Nicole, you talked earlier about relationship building, and what that does in most cases, I think really is pull or reveal the layers, or the depth rather, of the administrator. Can you talk about how important it is for us to be nuanced in data, in institutional research, and how that really moves? You noted that you look, as well as other leaders, look for transformational leaders, leaders with foresight. Can you talk about how that institutional research and the data, and how those two are married together to move? That oftentimes is a pretty good recipe for strategic planning. Can you talk about how important it is for administrators to develop that skill set before they get to the presidency or even the vice presidency?
So thank you for that question, Herman. That's actually a really, really good point about, one of my friends here says there's a difference between data and information, right? So the ability to translate raw data into information that can inform your strategy and your implementation is critical for presidents and administrations. We have a lot of data, but there are a lot of data points. Our IR offices, if you ask for it, they can find it. The question is, can you take that information? For example, university, and well, not a university, our college enrollment was down in the fall. Obviously, there was a pandemic. We spent a lot of time trying to understand not only why our enrollment was down, but who we were missing. So were we missing first time in college students? Were we missing low income students? Were we missing traditionally underrepresented groups? Who was it, right? And the ability to take that data and transform it into targeted communications and messaging to build emergency aid packages, all of those things really matter, but you do have to be able to peel back the layer and not just say our enrollment's down 12% because of a pandemic. You really do need to be able to understand and pull back the layers and show that you can take action to move in that process. And state policy is going to be critical in that, for example, because I know Florida, our enrollment is based, or in policy, our funding is based off of enrollment. We just had a workforce estimating conference where we looked at the enrollment of our colleges, and it's really hard to make the case for a increased funding or maintaining funding when enrollment is down. So the next level of that we have to do of peeling back is, okay, so if our enrollment is down, this is the funding we need, and this is how we're going to deploy it in order to bring back those students. So data information is critical to understand. Student services information, especially around, we were missing students. We had students who were got lost in COVID, right? Because you couldn't come into an institution and fill out the 15 pieces of paperwork. So we had students who were, showing interest, filling out the application, but not able to take the next step and actually process it because we had an issue with residency, right? So data is important in for being able to translate that and show how you can use it to mobilize and not paralyze is really, really critical.
I think it's really important for people to understand that when you get to that level of, I would say C-suite, vice president and above, there's going to be some keen competition. All of you will be nicely appointed. But those, I find in my interviewing process, those who understand data and information, the difference between the two, are really the ones that get it. And there are so many that don't understand the difference between those two. So I'm so happy that you really expounded upon the notion of data and information and how important it is. Particularly, I recognize it as a president, how there are you're never as smart as the board, right? There's 25 or 30 of them, and they're subject matter experts in their particular spaces. And there's going to be one that is like Nicole Washington, who is going to drill down on data. And if you're not able to get past that hurdle, it's going to be a challenge for you. I think moving over, Scott, there's a question about the asset map, and can you expound on that a little bit for folks here, that whole theory, that method of moving in state policy or it aiding?
Sure. Do what I can to try and expound on that. I think the idea is, each individual within the institution has an internal or an external ability to either accelerate your work or impair your work.
Mm-hmm.
From a trustee's point of view, how, basically doing something more than just what their bio is or their resume, but where do they have those kind of connections? Where can they offer a support and help? And where are their touch points that you don't want their engagement? You want them to be an asset.
Mm-hmm.
On the other side, thinking about your internal work, I think back to my time as a student assistant and the VP for government relations at the University of Central Florida, and one of my primary roles was to get pieces of legislation that were filed in the Florida legislature and send them to various members of the faculty for their review. Now, the VP wasn't doing this because he truly wanted them to come and testify on that legislation. What he was doing it for, it was to show the value of the government relations enterprise, but also, is there some advice you can give me as I'm representing the institution at the state level? So using your faculty that way so that they're part of the team. And then, the key thing is you always want students when you can get them to testify in committee. You don't want faculty. And that's a generalized statement, but it's a good one just to put in your pocket and just remember that, because students can carry your message so much better than even you can. In a lot of cases, but utilizing those corporate leaders on your board to accelerate your work and finding ways that is there a part of your plan that they are particularly engaged in, and then asking them, how can you help move this, either in the legislature, with employers, with others, with community leaders, with other organizations, and that sort of thing.
Can you talk a little bit about how tedious and painstaking and never-ending policy work is, and why people should understand that things won't happen overnight, but you have to have the staying power and to understand that you have to see things through. Policy work is not for the faint of heart, but I think people also need to understand that those who are meticulous more than others and have persistence oftentimes can find themselves successful. And also, I'd like for both of you to talk about the power of relationship in getting policy work effectuating change in that manner.
Absolutely. The analogy I would use is that it's like being a farmer in the movie Groundhog Day. That you plant this beautiful field of great ideas, and then the storm comes, everything dies, and you wake up the next day and you have to replant the field. And eventually you get to the point. So it's knowing that it's not, I run a lot, so it's not a 5K, it's not a sprint. It is a triathlon, full Ironman. You're gonna marathon. Swim, bike. Yeah, you gotta do it all. And so it's going to take a long time, and you've got to set the expectations of your board, and set the expectations of your leadership team that this is a long-term investment in the work. But here's what the ultimate goal is to get to. And then Nicole can talk about this too. The relationship piece is so incredibly vital. To have relationships of trust and relationships of honesty and authenticity with policymakers is vital. You always want to give them the clearest answer, because they will continue to pull on that thread. If they're interested in something about your institution, you want to make sure you give them the full story. And and when you have and knowing that it's not just having a relationship during legislative session, but it's in the doldrums of pre-election work, where you're finding opportunities for your students to be interns with legislator offices of both parties, and just getting your institution's name into legislators' brains, so that when you do come around and you want to talk to them about your agenda, that it's not the first time, and that they have that relationship with you and they were expecting you to come by. Nicole, I'm sure with the work you do every single day, you can talk a lot more eloquently than I can.
No, you're fine. I think you're right on target, Scott. Like I tell folks who, a lot of people reach out to me because they want to get, involved in higher ed policy because they think it's sexy. And the first thing I tell them, it is not. It is a long-term commitment. It requires you to have a large amount of resistance, resilience, and to weather peaks and valleys. I started, as a policy person, I started as an unpaid intern in Governor Rick Scott's office. Having both a bachelor's degree and a master's degree from 2 Ivy League institutions, and having had 5 years of work experience. That has paid off in leaps and bounds. Right now I sit, in a place because I was able to build relationships, develop very broad relationships with folks on either side of the table. And I think it makes it easier in education, because education shouldn't be partisan, right? Like we are all aiming towards student success. So I think that makes it a little bit easier. I work with whoever is willing to put a stake in the ground and say that they would like to see education more equitable. That has been Republican governors, it has been Democrats, it has been teachers, it has been institution leaders, it has been students, philanthropy. Every relationship matters. And I think that building that over time and understanding that people like to see the value of your work. So it's not just enough to be a nice person, but you have to be able to also show value and to be able to follow up. And be willing to entertain hard conversations. I can tell you that, this is not an easy, when you're talking about equity issues in higher education, it is not easy. And not everybody wants to hear exactly what you want to say the way you want it to convey your message. So how do you convey your message in a way that rings authentic to you, but does not turn off or immediately discard that person you're trying to build a relationship with, is also going to be key to long-term success.
Mm-hmm. I think you said a couple of things that stuck out to me. One, noticing the intentionality that you deployed in getting in the door. And how oftentimes we have to really think about where we want to go and really be strategic about it, and understand that, the beginning of the game doesn't have to remain the same. Where you start certainly isn't where you finish, but it could be a very solid platform. And you're a testament to that, the intentionality, having the credentials and the work, but being an unpaid intern, like that, the intentionality of that is powerful. But I want to touch on, and both of you can speak to this, the apolitical posture that educators and administrators must come to the table with. You can be whoever you are in your personal space, but when you work in this space, and you don't have to compromise your integrity or your morals, but you need to understand that both the R's and the D's have a vested interest in education. And for those who don't, you have to make them have it. Can we talk just a little bit about how important it is for us to understand that all politics are not local, and that when you put on your armor as a sentinel or a surrogate for equity, which I commend Lumina for being in that space as well, how important it is for you to understand that you're not a D or an R or an I. You're about equity. And I like the fact that you made clear that tough conversations are needed to have, which further buttresses the notion for armor to be put on to go into battle to do that equity work.
Well, I can start, and then I'm sure Scott's got way more context for this, but policy, education is a space where I think most people have the same sort of goal, right? The goal is that you want to put as many students as possible on paths to prosperity, and education, we know, is the path for many, and for the most. Even if there are folks who have not obviously done the education pathway, but when you look at data, it still is the pathway for the majority. So what I like to say is, be clear about your intentions and your outcomes, but flexible about the path, because I think that as long as you are clear about where you want to go, you do have to build relationships and be able to compromise in order to get there, because the way you have envisioned it may or may not be the best solution for the state or the institution at that time. And you have to be willing to let ego aside and really be able to build advocates, build a deep bench, and be able to move the solution that is best in the best interest of the group. And I think that's really hard, because I think many of us go in and sort of like, here I've got the policy and I've got the solution, I've researched it, I've done all my homework. However, given the context, it may or may not be the most viable solution at the time. So be clear on the outcome, flexible on how you get there. Make sure you bring people along with you, because that just amplifies your message, and it will be amplified. If you do it that way, it will be amplified in the tone that multiple people need to hear.
So I recall when I worked for Governor Mitch Daniels in Indiana, the Indiana University has a law school in Bloomington, but then they also sponsor the IUPUI, more kind of evening part-time law school. And it was fascinating to have the dean of that law school come in and meet with the governor, and immediately went into we should be funded differently. We serve most of state government. We serve the legal enterprise within Indianapolis. And then to have the conversation with the president of IU, McRobbie, what I would say is, let's also remember that the partisan issue is that you represent your institution. When you're there representing your institution, your party affiliation, your tribe is the institution that pays the bills, and that's who you represent. In just the brass tacks version of it. And we ain't got time for the party affiliation from a political standpoint, because your politics is to make sure your institution succeeds and can be successful and can raise resources and build policy that supports your students and the enterprise of your institution. And so the caution I always give is similar, Herman, to what you said, is that put some of that stuff aside, compartmentalize it, and focus on what's right and good for the institution, and around those types of relationships, because then there's room and oxygen for those conversations, for that trust and that relationship to develop.
Final question, and I'm going to ask that you leave us with some parting shots as you take a stab at this last question here. How can colleges effectively involve themselves in crafting policy that will improve higher ed, but probably on a more local level, their institutions, because we're all selfish at times. So how would you say, for especially let's just take a small private liberal arts, meager resourced institution that is looking for policy that might be beneficial to the institution? How do they get involved in that work?
Do you want to go first, Scott? Go ahead. So I will say that at every institution, you are already involved in policy. You probably don't realize it because it might be little p policy. And what institutions can do, and do a much better job of, is telling their stories, right? I feel like what institutions, when they feel like they're involved in policy, when they go to the state leaders, they talk about money. And while money is an enabler, it is not always the solution. And so having really concrete examples of what's happening at your institution that is really moving the needle, being able to share that story via the best vehicle, whether it's the student or somebody else. And just everybody is involved and everybody matters, right? Like faculty matter. There's often this tension that, faculty are obstructionists, but I say this every day. If the faculty don't show up, you don't have an institution. So they have an important voice as well, armed appropriately, right? So you have to be able to utilize the voices that are able to get your message across, but know that everybody's involved in policy. It's more of an aspect of finding the best instrument and then being able to bring solutions to state leaders, because state leaders are always looking for policy. They're always looking for ideas on how to improve the state landscape. And what I find when I put out a call to institutions is that many of them are doing what state leaders think that the problems that state leaders already want to fix. They're just not aware because there's not that clear line of communication. So my parting thoughts is use your trustees, tell them the stories, make sure they can amplify your messages, utilize their strategic strengths, right? Because some folks have a Nicole Washington, but you should also have a super entrepreneurial person on your board. You should have somebody who's really good at real estate development. You should have a good finance person who can really look at your books and be able to provide, because each of these elements gives you leverage to be able to do the work that you need to do at the end of the day.
That's right. Great point.
Yeah, Herman, at the end of this day, you'll have like no one that wants to actually be a president of a small liberal. Be like, I can't do 15 jobs, but one of those jobs is, the layers here, and something that Nicole didn't mention, but she's been instrumental in Florida is this idea that communities and regions have what's called a talent ecosystem, or and several of them have set goals around what do we want the talent within our community to look like and the types of degrees they want. In a lot of cases, that's going to be degrees with your institutions. So what is your role in that? How do you engage and be an anchor partner in an effort that might be in your county or might be in your city or community to say, we're going to be an anchor partner in an effort to increase the economic viability of our community, to upskill our own residents of our community, and what is our role in that, and how can we play a larger role? And then your voice isn't just one voice within a community. You're curating and catalyzing a lot more voices to support the types of education that we need to provide within your community, and you go with a coalition, because as we said at the beginning, the more people we can get in the room supporting the agenda, the better. And because you're going to have multiple overlapping responsibilities as a president or a senior VP, this is just one of them. That community engagement is an asset, and it's a strategy of an enrollment strategy, a re-enrollment strategy, a transfer strategy, and a state policy strategy.
This has been fun. Policy is, as Nicole said, is not sexy. It just, for some people, for some of us, data and policy and all that good stuff, we actually like it. It's fun, and you see the needle move at times. And when that happens, it makes all the work worth it. I think I'm going to share with you some of the comments to describe what this meeting or this panel has meant to our guests. But I want you to close out with a word or two about a nugget or so that you would give to an aspiring leader who is looking to make sure that his or her toolbox is replete with some very vital tools. What tools would you say are necessary for them to take on that journey with, and to make sure that they're very proficient in using them?
definitely need the data. You definitely need a good understanding of the data. You definitely need a circle that can counter you. So you definitely need people around you who create and enhance you, who don't have the same opinion as you, who are willing to challenge you in your perceptions, with data, and offer constructive criticism. Because, and I think you also have to be intentional about your path, because there are many distractions and many things happening in higher ed that are not what, the future of higher ed is not what the past is. And so how do you surround yourself with the information, tools, accessories, whether that's people or technology, to really be able to cast yourself as a standout leader for the next century of higher ed?
I would echo everything Nicole just said. What I would also say is that the power of the network that H.E.L.F brings together is one that people, you all know you can tap. You can tap your folks in your cohort. You can tap others that are involved in this process. And I won't speak for Nicole, but if you get into the top 3 of a presidential search in a southern state and you want some advice and counsel, Herman, please give them my contact information. I'm more than happy to give them the lay of the land and guide them in my best way. The last thing I would say is that most of you have mentors and people that you rely on for advice and counsel. At some point, you may have to say, I need to make a decision on my own. And to have strength of your own commitment, have your own ego, and go forth with it. Because I think without you saying to yourself, I can do this job, I can lead this institution, and not need to rely on other people to hold you up, but you can do it. You can do it, and you will do it, and people will be there to support you.
This information is very valuable to moving forward for progression. These are invaluable insights, great points, agreed, excellent analogy on putting party aside, the power of relationships, a powerful statement using data to mobilize and not paralyze. I can literally go on and on. I appreciate the conversation. This is an invaluable conversation once again. These are the sentiments of those who have joined us, and I couldn't agree with them more. Excellent conversation, and we at the Higher Education Leadership Foundation are indebted to you for taking time out of your busy schedules to come share with us and our populace to talk about some really important stuff. All politics are not local. Navigating and negotiating state policy. Please help me in thanking Scott Jenkins and Nicole Washington for facilitating as thought partners an excellent conversation. Clap, 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 clap. Thank you. Thank you both for being here. We really appreciate it. This concludes the panel on All Politics Are Not Local. Please stay tuned for our next panel entitled Building Our Own, How Administrators Cultivate Academic and Administrative Leaders from the Ground Up. We know that you have many things to do today. We hope that you'll spend the rest of your time with us today. But should you have the opportunity to stay with us for the next panel, you can simply stay on the page. Should you need to go away, you can simply go back out to our webpage at www.heleaders.org and click on the Watch Live Now for the 1:30 panel. Again, thank you, Scott and Nicole, for being here with us today. We appreciate it and wish you Godspeed and want you to stay safe.
Thank you.
Thank you. Take care.
Bye-bye.